Hey, gang. I saw a couple of videos on a possible second American Civil War on YouTube, and I just kind of wanted to react to them a little bit. There were two of them, and one of them really kind of really believed that this was a thing that's going to happen, and the other one, the one that I'm going to show you first, was skeptical of what individual gun rights would mean in a big, Civil War situation. I want to start this whole thing by saying I do not believe that we're on the verge of a second Civil War, but at the same time, I'm not naive enough to say that it would be impossible. In fact, I will say that within the last couple of months, I've seen a scenario that really made me think about the possibilities. And I want to outline that scenario because I feel like when they were debating the topic on the second video that I'm going to link to, they really missed the boat on how this might actually come down, and there was a lot of wild swinging and denialism, and it was an interesting debate. I would encourage you to watch as much of it as you can stand before you throw your phone against the wall. Um, there are some doozies in that debate, but I think that there's a lot of very good takeaways that you can get from that second video. So first things first, let's look at the first video, which talks about individual gun rights and the effect those might have in a civil war. So let's take it to that. Okay, I mean that is one man's take, so there is that, and credit that it was a short, and so he's just throwing out some hot sports opinions to get some clicks and some viewers. But I think that the premise is pretty flawed. The idea that, first of all, where he comes up with the idea that anybody is suggesting that a civil war would be fought between groups of armed civilians. I have no idea where that comes from. I've never heard anybody suggest that or think that, with the exception of the meme that basically says, who are you going to go, who do you want to side with in a civil war, the people with guns or the people with dildos and pussy hats? It's a joke, okay? It's supposed to be funny. So nobody believes that. And then his second point, I believe, completely dismisses the possibility that there would be any role, and that is that the government can just, they can outarm, overpower any civilian resistance. I think that there's some truth to that for sure, 100%, that the U.S. government, a federal military that is fully intact, would definitely outgun a armed civilian populace, and over time stands the best chance of catastrophically defeating that smaller threat. I appreciate asymmetric warfare. I understand the examples of Vietnam and Afghanistan, and I think that that's very relevant depending on how things break down. And speaking of how things would break down, I want to use this example to show ways that this could go wildly out of control in ways that I never thought possible. And I think that anybody that follows me on Twitter or Facebook probably can tell where I'm going with this, and that is where I think we came the closest to starting a process that we couldn't stop, and that was towards the end of January, beginning of February, when the Supreme Court came out and said that the federal administration could take down the barriers that Texas was erecting along our southern border. During the debate on this topic, I mean, I love what Governor Wheels did when he just said, I don't care, we're still going to, you can take it down, but we're just putting it right back up. We can put it up just as fast as you can take it down. Waste of your time and energy, but it's not a waste of our time because we're securing our border. And in response to that, and this is where I was worried for the first time, and that was there were Democrats, even Texas Democrats, that were suggesting that Biden federalized the Texas National Guard and then deployed them outside of the state so that they were no longer a resource for the governor to use. And that worried me a lot because in order to federalize the Texas National Guard over the protest of the state government, they would have had to use the Insurrection Act. And I think that one of the reasons that the Biden administration didn't use the Insurrection Act to federalize the Texas National Guard were the optics. The idea that before the world stage and everybody, they would declare that trying to protect our borders was an act of insurrection is such a nonsensical argument that, I mean, we would be the Biden administration would be the laughingstock of the international community. I mean, it's absurd, absolutely absurd. I think that the other reason why they didn't do this, and this is I've been, I was born in Texas. I've spent a lot of time in Texas. I did spend some time in the Navy, and I grew up in a Navy family, but the bulk of my life has been living here in Texas. And so I don't know about other state National Guards, but here in Texas, if the federal government, if the president federalized the government and federalized the National Guard and ordered them to deploy outside of the state, and the governor gave countermanding orders that said, no, you stay put, stay in the state, stay on the border, stay wherever you are, that a significant portion of, every one of those troops, 90% of those troops would be conflicted between state and federal loyalties. I believe that. How people would break, it really kind of comes down to what leadership thinks. And I imagine, you can't tell me that the leadership of the Texas National Guard doesn't have a plan or an idea of how to handle the situation. Point being, there could be a very large, well-regulated military presence within the state that's, between the professional military and a bunch of yokels with shotguns, rifles. And that's the beginning of it. Okay, so let's just say 15,000. We got some good equipment. We get some of the Air National Guard. There's a lot of people behind Texas. Definitely not enough to overcome the might of the American military, the United States military. Certainly not. But it's enough to make the federal government pause, I would think, to say, okay, are we really going to start shooting people? While this debate is going on, nobody's shooting at each other. They're circling the wagons. Everybody's getting their ducks in a row, trying to figure out what's going to happen next. Then Sorry, there was a little bit of a technical difficulty there. My kid destroyed some sweet potato fries in the air fryer. So I was saying, everybody's, kind of getting ready and trying to figure out what the next step is. And this is where the private gun ownership first rears its head. Because if there are targets of opportunity for local yahoos to go after, they might take those. So for example, and again, I want to state 100%, I am not endorsing this as action. I'm not suggesting that this is a good thing. I'm not suggesting this is what somebody should do if any of these facts, circumstances come down to actual being. But we have a lot of federal buildings in Texas. Every state does. And if there are civilian attacks on those buildings, gun ownership absolutely could be a part of that. There could be shootings, there could be bombings. It would not be unusual. It's unusual, but it wouldn't be unusual in a protest and a conflict environment. Think about what was happening during the St. Floyd riots when federal government buildings were being attacked, firebombed, etc. Okay, so this happens. There are some attacks on federal buildings, let's say in Austin. At this point, we've already used the Insurrection Act. It's possible that could escalate into some sort of martial law, where the military, we have, Fort Bliss, we have Fort Hood. There are plenty of Army units around here that could be sent to Austin to clear the streets and make sure that everything is under control. Throw a curfew out there, make sure, everybody is complying with any new ordinances that come down, any new orders that come down. Now, what happens if you have a Kent State type situation? Let's say there's a protest in Austin, and it escalates. There's rocks thrown, and next thing you know, gunshots. And one thing I want to say, and this is something that I cannot emphasize enough, and that is the military, besides the security forces, the military police and the security police, and the masters in arms, they are not policemen. They are. You don't want them being policemen, because they're not there to enforce laws. They weren't trained to enforce laws. They're trained to assess a threat and deal with it. And so that's how you end up with a Kent State type situation. I think that with active duty military, it might even be riskier. So once that happens, if that were to happen, there was a protest, the U.S. military fired on protesters, that irrelevant civilian gun ownership is absolutely going to suddenly be a thing, because there will be organized groups. Level of organization is going to vary, level of training and ability is going to vary, but they're going to set up and ambush soldiers in the streets. They are going to break into houses. They are going to make a mess of things. They are going to use those guns to absolutely fight a guerrilla war in Texas. And that is going to suddenly be something that has to be dealt with. It's going to be an escalation. So that's bad. Obviously, we don't want, a civil war. But that is literally something that has to be taken into consideration. And it drives me crazy when people look at it and say that's not a relevant factor, because it's going to be relevant. It's going to be a driving force. And in the example that I'm laying out, it's going to be something that could push us over the brink. And if you're making an analysis, if you're making a policy decision based on an analysis that says civilian gun ownership isn't going to make a difference, you're going to make a dumb mistake. And that's why I think that, well, again, one of the reasons why I think that they didn't try to federalize the Texas National Guard was because it's a step on a path that we don't want to go down. And that civilian gun ownership would be an important part of that path. And I can't reiterate this enough. I don't think we're crazy enough to get there. I think that there's a lot of red flags. I think that it's definitely something that could happen. I don't think that it will happen, and I don't want it to happen. But it absolutely is something that could happen. And so I think we really need to keep that in mind. And don't act like this is impossible. I think in the preface to almost every major conflict, there was a notion amongst the intelligentsia that, oh no, calmer heads will prevail, and we'll work this out. And I hate to say it, but oftentimes there's a complete lack of understanding between the two sides. And I really feel like that's something that's part of what's going on in the dynamic today, is that the coastal elites and the people that subscribe to those beliefs do not connect with what the center of the country are feeling when it comes to being disenfranchised, not understanding how this economy is supposed to help them. There's a lot of, I look at Bill Maher. This one blows me away, because he had a tendency. He was doing this a couple weeks ago. He's probably stopped by now, but basically when he'd have a guest on who said, "Man, this economy sucks," or the situation in America is just going downhill, he'd say, "Well, what does it mean to you? Like, how do you feel it?" And I was just like, "Really? Are you kidding me? Like, I living in Texas, I have to wait until my kid gets stabbed to death by a Venezuelan, gang member before I get to have an opinion on border policy? Get the hell out of here, Bill. That's nonsensical." Anyway, that's just an example of the disconnect. And I'm concerned, but not. I don't think it's going to happen, but it's something that's on my radar. Anyway, I just kind of wanted to get that out and let you guys see these videos. And the link to the second video will be in the description. But all right, take it easy, guys.